Hey, so just to continue with my analysis of heavyweight boxers, you'll recall in my last video I was discussing those guys whom I believe are overrated. I'd like to just repeat the disclaimer in that, or the caveat to that, which is that by saying a fighter is overrated, I'm not disrespecting the guy's achievements in the ring. So the guys I named, Mike Tyson, I think Jack Johnson, just from the notes here. Jack Dempsey, Joe Frazier. Um, I don't want to give the impression that I don't respect them by their own merit. I believe they were all great fighters, but if you look at the video, you'll see why I believe they're somewhat overrated. I'd still rank them as great, still have them in the top 20 without a question of a doubt, but I do think that sometimes those guys, Tyson especially, are overrated. So now I want to talk about guys who are, in my view, underappreciated, underrated. Um, with this analysis, I'm not necessarily talking about boxing academics, so professional sports journalists working for Ring Magazine or Boxing News or something like that. I'm talking more from a fan perspective. Um, a lot of the guys I'm going to name here have long been largely forgotten, which I think is very sad because it undermines the achievements that they certainly had. Um, in order to prepare for this, I've looked at records. So that is one thing I'm taking into account, the records these guys had. Also who they fought, who they beat. Another caveat I'd like to say is with the early fighters especially, it's not an exact science. We cannot be absolutely sure about this because, for one thing, the fight footage is vague, if it even exists. Um, so it's difficult to see in those old grainy black and white footage. It's very difficult to be precise. They obviously don't have the sort of technology we have today with CompuBox, that sort of thing. There was more corruption probably back then. There was racism, the color bar, which is something I'm going to mention in this as well. Um, and again, I'm sure there's guys that I will think of afterwards that I'll think, oh, I could have mentioned him in this video. So without further ado, I'm going to speak about some guys whom I believe are hugely underappreciated. I'm sticking to the heavyweight division for the reason I said earlier. If I cover the whole of boxing, it would just take a very long time. Um, and with some of these people, I'm not absolutely certain. It's more very loose speculation on my part. With boxing, more than any other sport, there's a lot of weight put on rankings. And I guess that's natural when you have a man-to-man sport. It's more personal in some ways than any other sport. It's more competitive in some ways than any other sport. So it's natural that there's more weight put on rankings. I don't think you'll ever have absolute agreement, and that's fine. That actually makes it more interesting from a fan perspective to have these um, well-natured debates on the subject. And as with the last video, I would ask people to be respectful in their feedback. Certainly feel free to disagree with me, but do be respectful. So, I'm going to name a few guys here whom I believe were underrated. Gene Tooney. I believe he is hugely underappreciated. Unfortunately, today he's chiefly known for his two fights with Jack Dempsey, and I think part of the reason that he's underappreciated is because of the controversy around the fight of the long count in 1927 when he was down for 14 seconds. Now, I fully agree that that is a controversial issue, and it may well be that Dempsey was robbed in the fight. However, they did have two fights, and Gene Tooney won the first fight with not the same level of controversy. And this was 1927. We're not talking, Jack Dempsey wasn't an old man here. He was still arguably at his peak. So I really think Gene Tooney needs more recognition for that victory. And if you look at his record, I'll go quote here from BoxRec if I can find it. I really do believe that Gene Tooney is hugely underappreciated. I think that Jack Dempsey, I keep making this comparison with Dempsey because we're contemporaries. We were obviously famous rivals, different personalities. Dempsey was quite rugged and aggressive. Gene Tooney was kind of the all-American boy, so there was that different sort of personality as well, which always was done well. But just looking at the Gene Tooney's record, it was incredible. His record, just waiting for the page to load here, 65 wins, one loss, one draw. Now, that's something that really is quite incredible. Um, and it isn't just Jack Dempsey he beat. He beat the very highly rated Tom Heaney of New Zealand. Um, Harry Greb he defeated. Tommy Gibbons. These are all, as far as I know, Hall of Famers. He drew with Harry Greb once, but beat him in another fight. George Carpentier, again, considered probably the greatest French fighter ever, along with Marcel Cerdan. In fact, he fought Harry Greb several times just looking at this record. Beat Tommy Loughran, sorry, drew with Tommy Loughran. So in this analysis, I'm looking at the guys who they fought as well. Battling Levinsky. A lot of these people wouldn't be well known today, but they were rated at the time. And you have to go by who someone fights at the time. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying Gene Tooney is the greatest heavyweight ever, of course, but I do believe he's underrated, and I believe that he deserves more recognition than he gets for beating the great Jack Dempsey twice. In the end of the day, controversy aside, a win is a win. And sometimes I think in boxing, so much is built on speculation, like what would be. What we can only really do is go on what is, not what would be. So there are people who say, had it not been for the long count, Dempsey would have won that fight. Truth is, we'll never know. And even if Dempsey had won, the point is it would be, 50-50 because Tooney won the first fight. So Gene Tooney is probably top of my list for underrated fighters. A few other fighters from that time. Again, this isn't necessarily underrated by boxing historians or boxing academics, but just guys who today have, on some level, been forgotten. I'm not going to speak in detail about their careers, but feel free to check it out on BoxRec. Tommy Loughran, um, Jack Sharkey, perhaps. Um, Now, a lot of guys here are on the list because of color bar. I'll speak about them in a second. One heavyweight from the early era, by which I mean the early 20th century, Young Stribling. Um, Tell a casual fan today, say that name, Young Stribling, very strong chance they won't know who the hell you're talking about. But Young Stribling was pretty dominant for a long time, and he was very highly rated by his contemporaries. So, um, having not knowing much about him, I know he was a bit of a wild man. He was a bit reckless outside the ring, and he died in a car crash very young. I believe he was only 28 when he died. But he's one of those guys who could have been a lot more. I believe he could have went much further. Certainly his record was impressive, and he was very highly rated by contemporaries. Take all those things on board, young Stribling probably deserves to be better remembered. Like I said, there was a lot of guys here that were impacted by the color bar, the infamous color bar of the time. Um, Sorry, before I continue, one more white fighter who's probably should be better remembered, Jake Kilrain. I think he went the distance with John L. Sullivan, who was the first world champion. Um, Jake Kilrain was a tough, tough man, as a lot of those early fighters were. And I'm simply naming him because, again, he was highly respected by contemporaries, but seems to have been largely forgotten today. Um, Jess Willard, I'd rank highly because he defeated Jack Dempsey, as far as I know. And unlike a lot of white fighters at the time, I don't think to what extent he was racist, I don't know. He did give Jack Johnson respect for winning the fight, so and he took part in a very, very one of the most famous fights of all time. So probably Jess Willard deserves respect for that. I wouldn't rank him as highly as Johnson, but maybe a bit higher. So the color bar. Some of these guys that I'm going to name, some of them did fight Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was arguably the greatest black fighter of his generation, but I do think a lot of these guys deserve much more recognition today than they get. Sam Langford is still relatively famous, but there's other guys that seem to be largely forgotten, and I think that's sad. So I'm going to name a few. Harry Wills, Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, and George Godfrey. Those guys, I believe, deserve to be better known today. I'll name them again. Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, George Godfrey, and Harry Wills. Sam Langford is still relatively well known, but every one of those guys could put up a hell of a fight. Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh had the longest professional boxing match on record, Paris 1909. I believe that lasted for 45 rounds. 45 rounds. That was about 3 hours, and both men very nearly died in that fight. It's difficult to fathom the sheer hell they went through. The simple fact that they both made history with that, I'd rank them both highly. But both men, I'd probably rank Joe Jeanette slightly higher because his record stands out slightly more. But I believe that both men would have got much more recognition had it not been for the color bar. I believe either man could have, and the same applies to George Godfrey. Incidentally, with George Godfrey, I'm talking about the second George Godfrey. There was an earlier George Godfrey from Canada, but I'm talking the second George Godfrey. Also thinking of that time, George Carpenter, French fighter. He's, along with Marcel Cerdan, considered the greatest Frenchman of all time. Um, Around the 20s and 30s, there was a guy called Walter Neusser, German. He was known as the Blonde Tiger. His record's pretty impressive, and again, he's one of these guys that sort of think, without knowing very much about him, looking at his record, it's impressive, and you sort of wonder, is this guy underappreciated? Why is he not better known? So I'm just throwing his name in there. Um, Looking at my list here, Max Baer and Primo Carnera are famous. I don't think they're necessarily underrated, but I think they would have gone much further had it not been for the circumstances. In the case of Max Baer, he didn't take his training resume seriously enough. I believe had he done so, he would have been an all-time great. As it turns out, he's a Hall of Famer. He's great, but I believe Max Baer could have been better. Primo Carnera, the problem with him was again he was controlled by the mob. That was widely alleged. Unfortunately, the mob ruined that for him. There's a lot of controversy over Carnera's career. Going a bit later in the 20th century, guys who are, in my view, underrated. Some of the heavyweights of that golden era in the 70s might well be underappreciated. George Chuvalo, possibly. When we think of the great 70s heavyweights, we obviously think Ali, Foreman, Frazier. Um, like I said in the last video, I think Frazier may be slightly overrated. I'm only saying that because I believe some of Ali's other opponents were just as good. Guys like Sonny Liston, for that matter, you could argue Sonny Liston was underrated in terms of historic legacy. Floyd Patterson possibly is underappreciated. Ingemar Johansson. Um, I'm naming guys who were champions and maybe deserve more recognition. Um, Joe Bogner, I'm not saying he's an all-time top 10 great heavyweight, but certainly in Britain he's underappreciated. I'd say he's one of our greatest heavyweights. World terms, I'm not saying, but I do think he's one of the best contenders. He definitely gave Ali a good fight. Um, who else can I name? Going back a bit, Tommy Farr, the Welshman. He went the distance with Joe Lewis. He's underappreciated, I would say. When I think about it, there really is a lot of guys out there who are underappreciated. Ken Norton. Now, Ken Norton, if you look at any of this, he's almost always ranked lower than Joe Frazier. But I put him on par with Joe Frazier, if not higher. As far as I know, he beat Joe Frazier, and he was actually a better all-round fighter, I would argue. I think Frazier gets a lot of recognition because of his sheer courage and toughness. But in terms of actual boxing skill, I'd rank Ken Norton slightly higher. Um, Ernie Shavers, famous for his heavy punch. In terms of, I need to see more Shavers fights to really establish if where he ranks as a great fighter. Ezra Charles, I would say, is very, very underrated. I put Ezra Charles possibly in the top 10 heavyweights ever. So, yeah, definitely Ezra Charles. Um, Looking a bit later, late 70s, 80s. Both Spinks brothers, I would say, are underappreciated. Leon Spinks especially. A lot of people will say the win he had against Ali was a fluke because Ali was getting past his prime. But a win is a win, and I know Ali beat him in the rematch, but I'm just putting his name in there. I'm not saying for an absolute fact these guys are much better than they're made out to be. I'm just saying that they're people who I believe there is a legitimate debate to be had. So I would say both Spinks brothers maybe should be slightly higher ranked. I'm not saying top 10, I'm not even saying top 20, but definitely top 30. I think they should both have a mention in top 30 heavyweights. Um, the same applies to Oliver McCall in the 90s. Um, he's a pretty impressive record. Some disappointing losses, but some impressive wins. I mean, he beat the great Lennox Lewis. Lewis avenged it, but there's a lot of guys who had an inconsistent record, and I think it had it not been for that inconsistency, they'd be much higher ranked. Tommy Morrison again, he's quite famous because obviously he had the role in Rocky Five. He's well known, but I think that Tommy Morrison is one of those guys that probably deserves a bit more recognition. And finally, Vladimir Klitschko. Now, this is one that I feel quite strongly about because he's one of my own personal favorite fighters. In fact, I'd say both Klitschko brothers are underappreciated. Um, Obviously, in the rankings, Klitschko has dominated the heavyweight division for a generation, and in boxing publications, he's top of the list in virtually every governing body except, I believe, the IBO. I believe that Chagayev is the recognized champion in one of those divisions. I forget which one. And maybe Wilder and Stavern and others. But anyway, I think everyone would agree that Klitschko has dominated this division for a generation. Now, there's a few things I'd like to say about Klitschko. People say, well, look at his opposition, look at the guys that beat him early on. There's three men who beat Vladimir Klitschko. That's Corey Sanders, Ross Purity, and Brewster. Now, none of those guys would be seen as all-time greats. They're seen as, at best, average fighters. So people then say, well, wait a second, they beat Klitschko, so how can you say that Klitschko's great? Well, I would say look at Henry Armstrong. Now, Henry Armstrong is generally regarded one of the greatest fighters who ever lived. It's not often remembered Armstrong lost his first three fights, or at least his first fight, by a guy who was unknown. Um, Sometimes you get situations whereby a fighter finds himself, especially in heavyweight boxing, later in their career, so they peak actually later on. Um, I would say that's the case for Klitschko. Now, the victories that he's had, people kind of criticize that because they say, well, the guys he beats are often exceptional. But I believe as time goes on, people will actually rank some of the opponents a bit higher. Guys like Alexander Povetkin. You see, I honestly believe there's a bias against East European Russian fighters. I don't know why, but there's generally the criticism is they have a boring technical style. A lot of Western fighters, British and American fighters, often criticize this, but in the end of the day, a win is a win. And just because guys from Eastern Europe have a certain style doesn't take away in my opinion, their record or their achievements as a fighter. So I believe in the future guys like Alexander Povetkin themselves will be higher ranked because Klitschko beat them. I really do believe that history will judge Vladimir Klitschko a lot better than current opinion. I'm the same with his brother. Of the two Klitschko brothers, Vitaly, I believe, is a harder puncher, maybe the tougher all-round fighter, but I believe that Vladimir Klitschko is a better all-round boxer. Um, I'd say Vitaly had more wars in the ring. He had tougher fights, but Vladimir is an incredibly formidable fighter. I believe that he could handle his own against any modern fighter, including Mike Tyson. I really do believe that. We'll never know because they never fought. But I really do think that if you get Klitschko in a ring with any great fighter of the last 20, 30 years, he would, if not beat them, then go the distance with them. I really do believe that you need to take on board the fact that a fighter can only be measured by who he fights in his time. Now, Vladimir Klitschko has dominated the heavyweight division for 11 years. He hasn't been beaten in 11 years. You can't take that away from him. Um, Plus, he brings something that I believe also needs to be recognized as a champion. He holds himself like an absolute sportsman. He is what a great champion should be. He is respectable. He is intelligent. He is everything that you would want in a great champion. And I really do think that history will, in the common fan perspective, will see Vladimir Klitschko much better than current opinion. As for him being boring, well, consider this. His fights sell out in Germany. There's a reason for that. Just because he's had relatively few fights in the United States, in my opinion, that shouldn't go against him. I do think there's a slight American bias against non-American fighters, and I think that's unfortunate. Um, I'm not saying Vladimir Klitschko's the greatest heavyweight ever. He's not. That's either Ali or Lewis, Joe Lewis. But I do believe that in future Klitschko will be, if not top five, then top 10 heavyweights ever. I really do believe that, and I'm basing that on everything I've said. He's been utterly dominant in his generation. You can't take that away from him. Those early losses, I'm not taking anything away from those guys. They won fair and square. But like I say, a lot of great fighters have been beaten by guys who are not that well known. I mean, Mike Tyson was beaten by Buster Douglas. So if you're going to criticize Klitschko for those early losses, then you need to apply that to other great fighters who were beaten by average guys. Um, so yeah, well, I've spoken for a long time here, but all of those guys I believe are underrated. Let me know your thoughts. This is all opinion, and you don't have to agree with me. If you do leave a thought, feel free to explain why. And thanks for watching. Sorry, I just had to get that out.